Right, thank you very much. And thank you, firstly, so much to the organisers who've been amazing and they've pulled together this brilliant programme. So very grateful to them, so thank you. As it's the beginning of the conference, it's appropriate they're going to start at the beginnings of life. So this opening talk, I'll be discussing maternity, infancy, and reproductive loss. And just to kind of be clear, that sort of trigger warning, I will be talking about themes like miscarriage and things like that, which I know are very emotive for a lot of people. So archaeological studies of infancy and maternity have really been gaining a lot of traction over recent years, in part thanks to people in this room, and that's fantastic. But I think it's still, I would say, a relatively neglected area of archaeological inquiry, but it is growing. And I think it's only really recently that the significance of the infant-mother nexus as a intertwined and entangled unit has really started to kind of, the significance of that has really started to be investigated. So infant remains provide intergenerational information that pertains to maternal health and maternal bodies rather than just their own short lives. And I think this is important because quite often we've treated them as though they're just these blank slates that have kind of appeared out of nowhere and interpreted them in those terms. And I think we as bioarchaeologists are really uniquely placed to investigate that relationship. So here what I want to do is just discuss some of the methodological developments and theoretical developments in the study of infant bones and the infant-mother nexus. I think before doing that, it's worth reflecting briefly on where we've come from. And I think if we think back to kind of the early 19th and 20th centuries, really infants and children were totally neglected in studies because it was all concerned with craniometrics and notions of race. And if we look at the writings of some early anthropologists like Ernest Houghton, writing in 1930, he says the skeletons of young subjects are of comparatively little anthropological value. Now, as we know, nothing could be further from the truth. The remains of infants and children are hugely valuable as this kind of sensitive barometer of overall population health and provide a really important window into past lives. But we do see Houghton's words kind of exemplified in some of these early excavation reports. This is one, Uden Villa, which is kind of quite a famous site because there were 97 infants excavated from the site. It was published in 1921, so one of those early ones. There were also a handful of adults excavated from the site, and I think, as you would expect for a report from this period, it focuses entirely just on those handful of adults, and the infants really are entirely neglected. And again, because of that, the need to look at race, or the desire to look at ideas of race. So the infants were then just kind of dismissed as the clandestine burials of women, probably prostitutes, who killed their unwanted offspring. So I think such interpretations we kind of might expect in the 1920s. It fits with the gender politics and misogyny of that time. But I think what's surprising is that these narratives persist even 100 years later in recent re-evaluations of this site. And we see similar narratives in relation to other large deposits of infant burial. So if we think about Ashkelon in Israel as well. Now, you know, we all love a good brothel story, but I think that there are other explanations that we could explore as well in relation to these burials. So, and I think one of the things that really changed was obviously in the sort of since the 1990s and the rise of feminist and gender archaeology, which was so important for kind of highlighting women's role in the past and also other invisible demographics like infants and children. So shockingly, the past wasn't just men. So this work was really important. And I think in relation to infant burials, of the work of Ellen Scott, who again looked at Romano-British burials, and looked at them through through a kind of different theoretical lens, and not just simply as the disposal of unwanted corpses. So I think all of that work has been really important. And then over the last few decades, bioarchaeological studies of infant remains across the 4 fields of anthropology have grown exponentially. So bioarchaeologists are increasingly exploring the culturally contingent nature of maternity, pregnancy, miscarriage, birth, infant death, and the beginnings of life as a complex entanglement of biocultural, biographical, and historically situated practices. Now, as bioarchaeologists, we know that infant burials provide some challenges for us. Their bones are very small, they're very easily disturbed. You can see that burial of an infant's been kind of disturbed there. Often they're buried in quite shallow graves relative to some of the older children and adults as well, and sometimes they end up being ploughed out. Their bones are often mistaken for small stones. We see I've got a pointer here, haven't I? I'll point this one. I think I'm doing something wrong. Well, anyway, if you look at the top left, the calcaneum and talus, they just don't even look like we would expect a calcaneum and talus to look like. So you can see how easy it is for these bones to be overlooked, and the teeth, the developing tooth crowns, very easily fall out of the sockets and then are missed at excavation. So that's one clear challenge for us. Another is that we just often don't have age-appropriate recording forms. So we try and kind of inventory infants and older children with using forms that are kind of just entirely inappropriate. And this is important because we've got these ossification centres that are developing at different times and stages, and we need to have forms that are appropriate. This is a form that my colleague, which was a PhD student of mine, Claire Hodson, and now very happy to have her as a colleague, and she developed this. So she did a lot of work on infancy for her PhD. So recording forms are really important. Terminology is really important, and the language that we use. I've included the age categories there that you see in Sure and Black, but they differ from the age categories that are published in standards by Bijkstra and Ubelacker, and they'll differ from the standards, the age categories used by someone else. So we can get in a real muddle with all of this, and I know I've looked at reports where they've talked about an infant, and then when I've gone back and looked in the appendix, they're talking about a 7-year-old. So it can get really confusing, and so we do need to be a little bit careful with this side of things. In terms of age estimation, I'm just whizzing through the challenges now. Try not to get too depressed. We tend to age infants most often using long bone length, so we just measure their long bones and put it in a regression equation and correlate it with age. So in this slide here, this is one of Claire's. It's quite hard to read, but on the axis there is age in gestational weeks, and each line is a single individual, and the blue blobs are the dental age, and then the corresponding age for the same individual from their long bone lengths. Now you can see there's a broad correlation between dental age and long bone length age up until about the age at birth, and then you can see there's a widening gap. So we really need to be careful, because if we're estimating age just on long bone lengths, we could be really underestimating the age of that child. And obviously we're dealing with non-survivors. These children died, there was something wrong with them, they were failure to thrive or whatever. So again, they might have been small for gestational age. So it's tricky, the aging side is tricky. And as we know also, children are born at different gestational ages. My children were born very different gestational ages. And so again, we need to think about things like that. It's that we can't differentiate between a stillborn baby and a baby who survived, say, a week or so. And this is kind of tricky, because for us, that moment of birth and being born alive is important. It's particularly important in certain religions and so on. So we can identify what's called the neonatal line, so this kind of line that appears in the tooth, but we only really see that if the child has survived for longer than, say, it's around 10 days or so that we'll see the line. So if we don't see it, it doesn't mean that the child was stillborn. It means that they just died before the line had chance to form. So this is a tricky thing. And then the final challenge I'll just quickly mention is pathology. Pathology in infants is a nightmare, because they're growing so rapidly, their bones are developing so quickly, that they can look very porous in a way that to us looks like pathology. the kinds of pathology that we see in adults. But of course, it just can be normal. It can be normal, rapid, woven bone produced as a part of growth. So we need to be really careful, and that's been a real challenge and one that Claire's been trying to address as well. So lots of challenges, and bioarchaeologists are increasingly looking how we can meet these challenges. But before I get on to some exciting new methods, I'm just going to touch more on the theoretical approach to infants and motherhood in the past. So, as Nairi Finley noted over a decade ago now, the pregnant body really represents the kind of ultimate transgression of the Western construct of these individual bodily boundedness, that we're all very separate, discrete bodies. So it is this body within a body. And not only is the pregnant woman carrying a baby, carrying another body, but there's an exchange of matter between the two. So it's not just the mum providing nutrients to the baby, there is a bi-directional flow of cells between the mother and the fetus. And these cells from the fetus don't just passively circulate within the mother, they can actually differentiate into functional cells for the mother, which is, I think, really fascinating. So this is something referred to as microchimerism. So even, you know, I've had 2 boys, so I may even have some male DNA from them kind of kicking around within me. So this is a real key challenge, not only to this idea of individualized bodies, but also the kind of definitions of the beginning and ends of an individual's lifespan. Because if that infant is then lost, but they still have functional cells within the mother, you know, it kind of blurs all of those boundaries. And this co-constitution of the infant and maternal body is, of course, also impacted by cultural understandings of fertility, conception, pregnancy, and the acquisition of personhood, because all of these can have implications for the agency and activities of the pregnant woman. So if we think about certain geographical constraints on pregnant women, or the types of food they eat, or the types of activity they undertake, these can all have impacts on the pregnant body. The reproductive body has also long been a powerful site of oppression and a means through which inequality and structural violence has been propagated, resulting in millions of avoidable maternal and infant deaths each year. Mullings, who's got a great chapter in Han and Tamori's book on the anthropology of reproduction, and she draws upon Foucault's biopower to evoke the necropolitics of reproduction. So an example that she provides for this is the violence perpetuated against enslaved black women in the United States, whose reproductive capacity was exploited to produce capital. So this idea of using reproduction as a means of control and violence and gaining capital. And another example of the necropolitics of reproduction are the mother and baby homes in the UK and Ireland over the last century, which was set up to receive unwed pregnant women until the birth of their babies. And one such home in Tuam in Galway has received global attention over recent years, when the local historian Catherine Corliss identified 796 infants whose bodies were unaccounted for, but are believed to have been deposited within these underground septic tanks, which obviously caused a national outcry. And so if we think about those infant bodies, they represent quite a dramatic materialization of this intense stigmatization and control of unmarried pregnant women during the 20th century. We think about another context in which women have been forced to relinquish their infants is the Foundling Hospital in London. Don't know if anyone here has ever been, but it's worth a visit. This was set up in the 18th century. Mothers left their infants at the homes if they were in financially straitened circumstances, or if the infant was perhaps illegitimate. And when they dropped their infant off, there was the date of admittance, a description of the clothing that the infant wore, if any, and then the mothers had to leave a token. And this token was to act as a kind of proof of identity if she later wanted to come and reclaim the body. So it's these tokens that I think are especially fascinating about the museum. And the vast majority of them are just scraps. They're like ribbons, scraps of material that have no intrinsic value. There's also like a wide range of artifacts, so coins, lots of objects that have been cut in half. And so there's been a study of these tokens by Sitarek, who she discusses the hospital's bureaucratic requirement to leave a token, and this is a quote from her, prompted mothers to distill their grief in an object. And as a consequence, they've preserved one of the most poignant materializations of past reproductive loss and the rupture that's represented by broken objects and the rupture of the infant-mother nexus. And actually, the logo for the museum is a halved token as well. So just turning to the burial evidence then, cultural conceptualizations of the mother-infant nexus are also important to consider in our interpretations of infant burials and associated material culture. So the bodily boundaries of a newly delivered infant are often conceived of as kind of dangerously insubstantial and ephemeral in some way. And we see this, for example, in the writings of Serenus. So it's common practice to bind infants in different cultures or strap the babies to the mother. And that's a way of kind of recreating a firm boundary around the infant or prolonging the infant-mother nexus, a sort of transitional womb. And I think such practices address the anxieties around the precariousness of life during this early period. And I think it's also no coincidence that a lot of perinatal remains are often buried in bounded features, like ditches or within pottery vessels. So Stevens did a study of burial urns from the Roman Mediterranean of infants, and noted that a number were also buried in vessels with grooved or ridged exteriors that are kind of almost reminiscent of these votive uteri that you sometimes see at temple sites. So this is one Roman villa site from the UK, and often what you see at these sites is obviously the burial of infants within that domestic sphere, but often in corners of the room, like again creating a kind of spatial boundedness, but also a proximity to the mother. And I think it's a funerary practice that reflects and reconstructs cultural understandings of pregnancy loss, maternal bodies and reproduction. And again, these objects and features are signalling an unease with the unbounded nature of the infant once it's separated from the body of the mother. And this ruptured nexus is what Mary can be considered in what Mary Douglas refers to as matter out of place. And sort of becomes then polluting and dangerous. So creating a kind of false uterus for the child in terms of spatial arrangements or burial with an urn then is a form of sort of rebinding them. And that can also serve to reconfigure maternal boundaries, making her uterus available and whole for future reproduction as well. So cross-culturally, it's been observed that some mothers do not just figuratively lose a part of themselves with the death of the newborn, but do so in a very literal sense. So recent work within theology, sociology, anthropology on pregnancy loss has begun to explore the various cultural responses to miscarriage in stillborn infants, and we'll hear a bit more about this later this afternoon. The pregnant body is an expectant body. We talk about expecting. So it's a body whose boundaries are shifting and which signals a future outcome. So it's a body in waiting. But what happens when those expectations do not come to fruition? So almost a quarter of pregnancies end in miscarriage, not including those very early pregnancy losses of less than 5 to 6 weeks. But we've tended not to reflect too much upon this in the archaeological record when we encounter fetal and infant remains. So Sean Halcrow and colleagues in 2018 provide a really useful synthesis and discussion of the bioarchaeological evidence of fetuses. And then more recently, there's been other examples of earlier reproductive loss. So the mummified remains of a fetus, the mummified remains of a fetus here from ancient Egypt, from a second trimester fetus, and then this small wooden box contains the remains of a first trimester fetus, and this was recovered from underneath the floorboards of a church, and it's believed the box is believed to date to the 19th century. And there was some natural mummification processes as well, which facilitated the bone survival. And the authors describe how the practice of burying fetal remains in and around the walls of churches was commonplace in Sweden and Norway. And these kind of funerary preparations may also have served as an outlet and a focus for grief, and could also have served a symbolic purpose of healing the ruptured maternal boundaries. So talking about the intergenerational health now. So as I said, in bioarchaeology, the interconnectedness of the infant and mother means that the infant skeleton provides really important insights into maternal health, even in the absence of that direct connection in the archaeological record, like an infant mother burial. So if we're seeing nutritional deficiencies in infant remains, these are reflecting the health status of the mother. So if we look at the teeth, they're teeth from the same person, but the deciduous molar there was starting to develop in utero. So there's stress that this child has experienced from the interuterine period onwards, and that's indicative that the mother was also stressed as well. And then these other bones, you can see the very porous scapula there, and then the cross-section of those long bones should not look like that. That is not normal. It's not taphonomy either, it's pathology. And when we're seeing newborn babies with this level of pathology, we're obviously looking at maternal stress. One of my colleagues, Jo Moore, who was a PhD student of mine a little while ago, did some work for her PhD looking at Roman lead exposure. And as you can see from this figure here, there's really high levels of lead within the fetal remains in particular. Now, when a woman is pregnant, what happens is any lead that's contained within her bones through her own consumption during her lifetime, it'll get locked away in her bones, and then when she's pregnant, it'll become released from those bones, and then it will get absorbed by the fetus. So the lead that we're seeing in the fetus is not just any kind of lead that the pregnant woman's exposed to. It can be a lifetime of exposure. And what Jo also found was that the lead levels were much higher in the children in her samples, and also that there was a correlation between those that had high lead and skeletal indicators of pathology as well. So a really interesting study then. And I've mentioned Claire a couple of times. So as I say, her research was really looking at infant pathology. And she published a report on the site of Piddington, again, another Roman site from Britain, and really high levels. There were about 17 infants, I think, but very high levels of pathology in these infants. So what was going on? What was going on with their mums? What was happening? We did a little bit more research into these with one of my master's students, Ariam. And we tried to apply some new techniques to the analysis of the infants. So we applied amelogenin peptide analysis, which was developed with Nick Stewart, getting on for 10 years ago now. God, that's gone quick. And we found that this method works very well on infant bones. So the teeth don't even have to be fully mineralized for you to be able to retrieve these enamel peptides from the teeth. And the fact that it's barely destructive, it's minimally destructive, is obviously really important too in terms of archaeological curation and ethics. So we applied this method to the infants to work out the sex of them. We also applied incremental dentine analysis. Julia Beaumont and my colleague Janet Montgomery have done loads of pioneering work on this. And you can still get a number of increments even from just those developing deciduous teeth. And what we found, so with this example here, the dark blue line, you see the nitrogen is going high towards that period of birth, and the carbon is going low. And usually that's associated with some kind of physiological stress. So that suggests to us that the mother was perhaps stressed. And we certainly found a correlation between high nitrogen and pathologies, and also a lack of bacterial bioerosion, which I've not really got time to go into. So it was interesting that all of these techniques kind of correlated. I've got a student at the moment, Naomi Kilburn, who's working on ear ossicles. Julia Beaumont, with one of her students, analysed ear ossicles, which start to form very early, so before the teeth start to develop. And once they're formed, that's pretty much it. We think there's a later mineralisation period, about 18 months, 2 years, but actually the clinical literature is a little bit uncertain on this. So Naomi's doing two things. Firstly, she's looking at the extent of mineralisation when that actually happens. So she's doing lots of CT scans, and she's also doing isotope analysis on them, and she's comparing those isotope results with incremental analysis from the teeth of the same people as well. So she's doing lots of analysis to see how these things kind of correlate together. So why is it important for us to look at intrauterine stress? Well, this is because what happens then and in early childhood affects everything in later life. So it will impact on chronic disease risk later on in life. So recently, there's the developmental origins of health and disease hypothesis has highlighted in the first 1,000 days in particular as being a sensitive window of developmental plasticity, meaning that any adversity experienced by the infants in utero or shortly after birth can potentially alter phenotypic trajectories with implications for kind of metabolic disease and things like that, and increasing a risk of disease. A really well-cited example of this that usually comes out when people talk about DOHAD is the Dutch hunger winter. So that's a 5-month period of famine during the Second World War, where calories dropped really low for this so everything was fine, dropped really low for 5 months and then returned to normal. And so there's been studies of people who were pregnant and the infants at different gestational ages that they were affected by the famine, and there's been longitudinal studies of their life, but also then longitudinal studies of the grandchildren as well. And what they found is lifelong impacts, and those differ slightly depending on the gestational age in which the people were affected, so including cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, mental health disorders as well. So there's all kinds of implications, but I think one of the key findings is that it's the health of the subsequent generation that is also affected or impacted by that famine. So I think that has has implications for research on health in the present, but also when we're thinking about famine through various periods in the past. So if we think about Sharon DeWitt's work on the Black Death, what she's also noted is that those that show childhood indicators of health stress are more likely to have been susceptible to dying from the Black Death as well. So we're seeing these correlations, and there's this ripple effect. So before we've treated health as though it's a response to a very discrete, it's an immediate response to a discrete stressor, but actually there are kind of these effects that go on. And I think this is also important because it forces us to consider not only biographical but also intergenerational trajectories of health. So if an event like famine can cause a ripple effect of poor health outcomes down the generations, then we have to shift away from proximate causes disease alone and consider that disease and poor health can arise from this accumulation of risk, not just across a single life course, but potentially across generations. And I think DOHAD, and together with the phenomenon of microchimerism that I mentioned earlier on, in which cells of the fetus have a functional lifespan after death, I think both of these things represent quite a fundamental challenge to this paradigm of this bounded body and this bounded separate life courses. I think the fetal and infant entities reveal us to be genomically, physiologically, and temporally quite fluid. So if events affecting my grandmother's life have implications for my own phenotypic trajectory, then when does her life end and my life begin? So I think it blurs these divisions between self and other, past, present, and future. And as Han and colleagues state in their book on the anthropology of the fetuses, the fetus or infant, and this is a quote from them, is both materially and metaphorically a product of the past, a marker of the present, and an embodiment of the future. So the biological matter of the infant then is co-constituted amongst a complex entanglement of ecological and social processes, some of which predated their own existence. And this figure here is just trying to kind of highlight some of that kind of nested relationships. Okay, just to summarise then, the archaeological record for the mother-infant nexus is abundant in terms of both the material evidence and the skeletal evidence. And I think there's still so much scope and so much work to be done. You know, we're just really at the tip of the iceberg, I think. And I think concepts of the infant-mother nexus are also important for helping us interpret those burial practices, not just the bodies. And dohad and microchimerism, I think, represent a real challenge to our construct of this bounded body and discrete separate life courses. So fetal and infant remains then provide really unique intergenerational insights into maternal well-being and into health. And I think we're just now developing all of these new scientific methods that are helping us address and ask new questions of the past that can have relevance for today. And I'm really looking forward to the papers over the next few days that are starting to do this work. So thank you very much. Thank you.